The sound of cardboard scraping against the hallway carpet was a rhythmic, abrasive intrusion that pulled me from a shallow, trauma-induced sleep. For a split second, the previous day felt like a fever dream. The cold glass walls of the HR office, the sterile, were moving in a different direction speech, and the heavy weight of my cardboard desk organizer as I walked past colleagues who suddenly found their spreadsheets intensely fascinating to avoid eye contact. But the scraping sound was real. It was rhythmic, domestic, and utterly final. I pushed myself out of bed, my limbs feeling like lead. I hadn't even changed out of my work blouse from the day before. The silk was wrinkled, a map of my collapse. When I swung the door open, the hallway was a gauntlet. Four large, heavy-duty boxes stood like sentinels outside my room, their flaps already sealed with thick, tan packing tape. My mother stood at the end of the hall, the tape dispenser still clutched in her hand like a weapon. She didn't look tired. In fact, she looked energized, her posture rigid, and her eyes bright with a terrifying kind of pragmatic clarity. My father was behind her, leaning against the doorframe of the linen closet, staring intensely at a loose thread on his shirt sleeve. He was the king of looking away when the world got ugly. "You're 24, Clara," my mother said. There was no good morning, no "how are you holding up?" Her voice had the flat, percussive quality of a judge reading a foreclosure notice. The marketing firm was supposed to be your launching pad. That promotion was meant to be your ticket to a condo, independence, and a life we didn't have to subsidize. But you've managed to lose it in under 2 years. "I didn't manage to lose it, Mom," I said, my voice cracking. I tried to find the strength to explain the company's stock plunge, the 30% workforce reduction, and the fact that my boss had cried while handing me the severance envelope. "They laid off half the department. It wasn't about me. It's always about you, Clara," she snapped, the tape dispenser clacking onto the hallway table. "The winners stay. The losers get boxes. We've spent 2 decades pouring resources into you. Tutors, college, this room, waiting for a return on that investment. We aren't subsidizing your failure anymore. We've decided to turn this wing of the house into your father's new hobby suite. We need the space by noon." I looked at my father, pleading for a shred of the man who used to tuck me in and tell me I could be anything. He finally looked up, but his eyes were hollow, reflecting my mother's cold resolve. "It's for your own good, Bertie," he mumbled, using an old nickname that felt like a slap in this context. "A little pressure creates diamonds. You'll figure it out. You've got your car, your youth, and a few weeks of severance. That's more than most get." They didn't ask where I would go. They didn't ask if I had enough in savings for a security deposit in a city where a studio apartment cost more than a kidney. They simply handed me a printed sheet of paper, a list of local motels with weekly rates, and a help wanted section clipped from a local circular. "The boxes are already packed with your essentials," my mother continued, her tone shifting to that of a drill sergeant. "The rest of your trinkets and clothes are in the garage. We'll keep them there for 48 hours. After that, they go to Goodwill. We're going to brunch at the club now. I expect the driveway to be clear when we return." They walked past me as if I were a ghost, the scent of my mother's expensive perfume lingering in the air like an insult. I heard the heavy front door click shut, and then the roar of my father's SUV, fading into the distance. The silence that followed was deafening. I sank to the floor, my back against the closed boxes of my own life. For years, I had lived under the crushing weight of their expectations, always feeling like a disappointment, despite my honors degrees and late nights at the office. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I was a project that had failed to yield a profit. I pulled the severance envelope from my pocket. It was enough to survive for 2 months, maybe 3, if I ate nothing but ramen and lived in my car. But as I stared at the tan tape on the boxes, a memory began to flicker in the back of my mind. A memory of a different kind of salt air, far away from the stifling suburban humidity of my parents' neighborhood. They thought they knew everything about me. They thought they knew my bank balance, my aspirations, and my limits. But they had spent so much time looking down at me that they had failed to notice when I started building a life in the shadows. 3 years ago, my grandmother Elise, my mother's mother, the black sheep, who had spent her life painting canvases in a shack by the coast, had passed away. My mother had dismissed her as a senile eccentric and refused to attend the reading of the will, claiming there was nothing of value to be had from a woman who lived like a beach bum. She had sent me in her place a legal proxy to sign away any junk left behind. But Grandma Elise had seen the flicker of rebellion in me during those childhood summers. She hadn't left me jewelry or stocks. She had left me a deed, a small weathered property in a town called Gray Ledge, 3 hours south. It was a place where the cell service was spotty, and the tourists rarely ventured. I had kept it a secret. I had spent my small year-end bonuses over the last 2 years paying the back taxes and hiring a local handyman to make sure the roof didn't leak. I had told myself it was just an insurance policy, a place to escape to when the corporate world felt too heavy. I never imagined I'd be using it as a life raft. I stood up and grabbed the first box. It was heavy, filled with the books and sweaters my mother deemed essential. I dragged it to the stairs, the sound echoing through the empty, sterile house. I wasn't the girl they thought I was. They saw a fired marketing assistant with nowhere to go. They didn't see the woman with a set of keys to a porch that overlooked the Atlantic. They wanted to see me crawl? Fine. Let them believe the lie for a little longer. I loaded the boxes into my sedan, one by one, until the suspension groaned. I didn't stop to look back at my childhood bedroom or the photos on the mantel. I didn't leave a note. I just pulled out of the driveway, the motel list fluttering out the window and into the gutter. As I hit the highway, the GPS pointed south. The sun was climbing higher, burning through the morning mist. My parents had packed my bags, thinking they were casting me out into the wilderness. They had no idea they were finally giving me the shove I needed to go home. The 3-hour drive felt like a transition between two different lives. With every mile marker, the suffocating grip of my mother's voice grew fainter. I turned off the radio and let the wind whistle through the cracked window. I was jobless, disowned, and technically homeless by suburban standards. But as the first whiff of brine and decaying kelp hit my senses, I felt a strange, terrifying surge of power. I reached into my glove box and wrapped my fingers around a rusted brass key. It was cold and heavy. It was the key to a house they didn't know I owned, and the start of a story they wouldn't be allowed to read. Being underestimated wasn't a curse. It was my greatest tactical advantage. The drive south was a visceral stripping away of the person I had been forced to be. With every exit sign passed, the high-gloss veneer of the suburbs faded, replaced by gnarled oaks and the increasingly ragged architecture of the coast. My phone, nestled in the cup holder, was a frantic insect, buzzing with notifications I refused to touch. There were texts from my sister Sarah, likely dripping with that performative sympathy she used to mask her triumph. There were probably emails from my mother, already detailing the storage fees she'd charge if I didn't move the rest of my things. I let the battery die. I wanted the silence to be as absolute as the ocean as I crossed the bridge into Gray Ledge. The landscape shifted into a palette of bruised purples and deep greens. This wasn't the manicured beach of a resort town. This was a place of survival. The air turned thick and heavy with the scent of salt, wet cedar, and something ancient. It was a smell that lived in the back of my throat, a taste of iron and brine that felt more like home than the lavender-scented hallways of my parents' house ever had. I found the turnoff, a narrow, sandy vein of a road hidden between two towering dunes, overgrown with sea oats. My tires crunched over gravel and crushed oyster shells, the sound echoing in the stillness of the afternoon, and then there it was. The house didn't look like a sanctuary at first glance. It looked like a ghost. It was a small, two-story box of weathered cedar shingles that had turned a silvery, salt-washed gray. The white trim was peeling in long, curling ribbons like birch bark, and the wraparound porch sagged slightly to the left, as if leaning into the wind. It was lonely and stubborn, perched on a rise of land that felt like the very edge of the world. I parked the car and sat there for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. My hands were still shaking, a delayed reaction to the morning's execution. I looked at the boxes in my back seat, my essentials, packed by a woman who didn't know I liked poetry, or that I had kept every letter my grandmother ever sent me. To my mother, my life was a collection of practical sweaters and sensible shoes. I stepped out of the car, and the wind hit me. It wasn't the gentle breeze of a park. It was the Atlantic, vast and indifferent, pushing against my chest as if testing my resolve. I walked up the porch steps, the wood groaning a familiar greeting under my boots. When I slid the heavy brass key into the lock, I expected resistance, but the mechanism turned with a smooth, oiled click. The handyman I'd paid through a secret Venmo account had done his job well. The door swung open to the smell of dust and dried seaweed. It was cold inside, the kind of deep-seated chill that lives in buildings that haven't felt the breath of a human in years. I walked into the main room, my footsteps hollow on the wide plank floors. The furniture was draped in yellowed sheets, looking like a gathering of polite phantoms. I walked straight to the back of the house, where the large, salt-crusted windows faced the sea. I didn't open the boxes. I didn't check the pantry. I just stood there, watching the tide come in. The Atlantic was a churning mess of slate and foam today, the waves crashing against the rocks with a violence that I found strangely comforting. It matched the roar in my head. "You lost," my mother's voice whispered in my memory. "You're a failure." I pressed my forehead against the cold glass. If I was a failure, then this house was my monument to it. My grandmother had left me this place because she knew the world would eventually try to eat me alive. She had lived her whole life being called difficult and eccentric because she refused to be a footnote in someone else's biography. She had built this fortress to keep the noise out, and now it was mine. By dusk, the shadows in the house grew long and distorted. I finally began to move, but not to unpack my parents' boxes. I went to the fireplace, a massive, soot-stained hearth made of river stone. I found a stack of old driftwood in the bin and some yellowed newspapers from a decade ago. I struck a match and watched the flame take hold, the orange light flickering across the walls, chasing the phantoms back into the corners. I dragged one of the sheet-covered armchairs toward the fire and sat down, wrapped in a trench coat that was too thin for the coastal damp. For the first time since the HR director had cleared her throat to begin the termination meeting, the tightness in my jaw began to ease. In the suburbs, everything was about the next step, the next promotion, the next tax bracket, the next social obligation. Here, the only next step was the next wave. The ocean didn't care about my resume. It didn't care that I was currently a disappointment to the two people who had given me life. It was just water and salt and gravity, over and over again. I realized then that my parents hadn't just packed my bags. They had inadvertently handed me the keys to my own liberation. By declaring me dead to their world, they had released me from the obligation of trying to fit into it. They thought I was in a motel room right now, crying into a pillow and calculating how many days of pride I had left before I crawled back to their doorstep. They were waiting for the phone call that would signal my surrender. I looked at the dead phone on the floor. I thought about the beach house, hidden by the dunes, invisible to the road and the world. I was a secret. I was a ghost. And for a girl who had spent her life being scrutinized under a microscope of perfection, being a ghost was the most powerful thing I could imagine. The sound of the salt hitting the windows became a lullaby. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a job. I didn't even have a working refrigerator. But as the fire burned down to glowing embers, I felt a quiet, jagged strength beginning to knit itself together in the spaces where my heart had been broken. They wanted a diamond? Fine. But diamonds are formed under the weight of mountains, in the dark, where no one is watching. I would give them their diamond eventually, but I would make sure the edges were sharp enough to draw blood. I closed my eyes, the rhythmic pulse of the tide, marking the first night of a life that belonged entirely to me. The first month was not an exercise in healing. It was a grueling, physical exorcism of the girl who had been taught to seek permission for her own existence. The transition from a climate-controlled office to a drafty, salt-eroded cottage was a shock that my body registered in bruises and blisters. My severance pay was a finite lifeline, and I treated every cent like a drop of water in a desert. I spent the first week doing nothing but cleaning, scrub brush in hand, scouring away the layers of neglect that had settled over my grandmother's legacy. I worked until my fingernails were jagged and my back throbbed, fueled by a cold, quiet spite. Every time I felt my resolve waver, I pictured my mother's face as she taped those boxes shut. I pictured my father's cowardice. That image became my engine. I spent the mornings at a local hardware store, a dusty place that smelled of sawdust and kerosene, where the owner, a man named Miller with skin like cracked leather, didn't ask me why a girl in a designer trench coat was buying a power sander and wood filler. He just showed me how to check the grain and told me which sealants could withstand the Atlantic's winter teeth. By the second month, the reconstruction had moved from my hands into my soul. I spent my days at the Drift, a small, weather-beaten cafe in town where the coffee was strong enough to peel paint. I wasn't just there for the caffeine, I was there for the paycheck. I took a job as a server, trading my marketing degree for an apron and a tray. It was humbling, exhausting, and exactly what I needed. In the corporate world, my value had been tied to quarterly projections and the whims of middle management. Here, my value was tied to the speed of my service and the genuine warmth I offered to the fishermen and locals who occupied the booths. In the evenings, I returned to the house. I stripped the warped floorboards in the living room, the screaming whine of the sander drowning out the echoes of my family's voices. Beneath the grime and the water damage, I found heart pine, rich, amber-hued wood that glowed when the light hit it. It felt like a metaphor I was almost too tired to appreciate. I was stripping away the rot of my upbringing, finding something sturdy and beautiful underneath that had been hidden for years. I also began to paint. Not the sterile, corporate graphics I had been paid to produce in my former life, but the raw, violent beauty of the coast. My grandmother had left behind a trove of high-quality oils and canvases tucked away in a cedar chest. At first, it was just a way to fill the quiet hours, but soon it became an obsession. I painted the waves as they looked during a storm, not blue and inviting, but gray, white, and terrifying. I painted the way the salt air seemed to blur the line between the sky and the sea. One afternoon, a local gallery owner named Elena stopped by the cafe. She had heard rumors of the city girl fixing up the old Elise property. She followed me back to the cottage one evening, her eyes scanning the progress of my renovations before landing on the canvases propped against the freshly painted sky blue walls. Elise had the technique, Elena said, her voice a low rasp. But you have the anger. It's vibrant, it's honest. She didn't offer me a contract on the spot, but she gave me a list of supplies and a challenge. Give me 10 more like these by midsummer, and we'll talk about a window display. I stopped checking my phone entirely. The battery had long since died, and I had tucked it into a drawer full of old coasters. I didn't need the digital tether to a world that had discarded me. Instead, I learned the rhythm of the tides. I learned that if the wind blew from the northeast, the roof would groan in a specific way that meant I needed to check the shingles. I learned that the locals in Gray Ledge didn't care about who my father was or what school I had attended. They cared if I showed up for my shift on time, and if I was willing to help clear the brush after a gale. There was a profound, terrifying freedom in being a nobody. In my parents' house, I was a failed investment. In my old job, I was a line item on a budget. But in the salt-cracked mirrors of the beach house, I was a woman who could patch a leak, sand a floor, and capture the fury of the Atlantic on a piece of fabric. I was also learning to eat again. Not the hurried, anxious salads at my desk, but real food. Fresh fish bought off the docks, bread still warm from the town bakery, and vegetables grown in the small, sandy plot I'd cleared behind the porch. I was gaining a different kind of weight. My muscles were becoming lean and functional, and the hollow look in my eyes was being replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. As the weeks bled into months, the house transformed. The sagging porch was braced and leveled. The peeling white paint was replaced by a deep slate blue that made the cottage look like it belonged to the sea. Inside, the rooms felt airy and intentional. I had sold the essential furniture my mother had packed. The heavy, dark wood pieces that felt like anchors, and replaced them with driftwood tables and soft, linen-covered chairs I'd found at estate sales. I realized that I wasn't just rebuilding a house. I was creating a sanctuary where the version of Clara they had tried to kill could finally grow. I wasn't waiting for a rescue. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I was building a life that was so sturdy and so deeply rooted in the sand that no storm, certainly not one generated by my mother's temper, could ever knock it down. By the end of the third month, I sat on my porch with a glass of cheap wine, watching the moon cast a silver path across the water. I had less money in my bank account than I ever had in my adult life, but I felt wealthier than I had ever been. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of potential. I had found my worth not in a paycheck or a title, but in the calloused skin of my palms and the steady beat of my own heart. I was no longer a daughter in exile. I was a woman in her element, and the reconstruction was nearly complete. The arrival of the black SUV was a glitch in the horizon. I was standing on the wraparound porch, my hair tied back with a piece of twine, my forearms dusted with white paint from the final coat on the porch railings. The vehicle didn't belong in Gray Ledge. It was too clean, too expensive, and it moved over the gravel driveway with a hesitant, aristocratic shudder. I didn't need to see the license plate to know who was inside. The air around the house seemed to chill, the salt-scented breeze suddenly feeling like the sterile draft of a funeral parlor. They stepped out in a sequence that felt choreographed. First, my sister Sarah, clad in linen trousers that cost more than my entire renovation budget, looking at the sandy dunes with an expression of profound distaste. Then my father, who adjusted his sunglasses and looked at the house with a confused, squinting intensity. Finally, my mother. She stepped onto the gravel and smoothed her silk blouse, her eyes immediately locking onto me as if she were scanning for a weakness she could exploit. "So," my mother said, her voice cutting through the sound of the crashing waves, "this is where you've been hiding while we spent months wondering if you were even alive." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. "You didn't wonder," I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself. I didn't move from my spot on the porch. I stayed elevated, looking down. "You knew exactly where you left me. You left me with 4 boxes and a list of motels. If I were alive or dead, it wouldn't have mattered as long as I wasn't in your guest room." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes darting to the Clara's Coastal Design sign that hung by the front door, a hand-carved piece of cedar I'd finished just last week. "Is this a joke? Clara, we've been frantic. Mom's had migraines for weeks. We thought you'd spiraled. And now we find out you've been squatting in Grandma's old shack. Why didn't you tell us you'd fixed it up?" "It's not a shack, Sarah. And I didn't fix it up for you to have a summer home," I replied. I wiped a smudge of paint onto my jeans, a gesture of casual indifference that I knew would infuriate my mother. My father finally spoke, his voice carrying a forced, jovial note that made my skin crawl. Now, let's not get off on the wrong foot. We saw the exterior from the road. It's impressive, Bertie. Truly, I had no idea you had this kind of grit. We actually came here to tell you that the hobby suite conversion is on hold. We thought, after 6 months of finding yourself, you'd be ready to come home and start a real job hunt. We even talked to Bob over at the firm. He's willing to give you an interview." I looked at him, really looked at him. He was offering me a cage with gold bars, thinking he was doing me a favor. He was offering me a return to a life where I was a project to be managed, a failure to be corrected. "I have a job," I said, gesturing toward the studio windows where my latest canvases were drying. "I have a house, and I have a life that doesn't involve Bob or your hobby suite or the crushing weight of your expectations." My mother's face shifted. The mask of concerned parent slipped, revealing the sharp, jagged edges of the woman who had taped my life shut in a single morning. She walked toward the porch steps, her designer heels sinking into the soft sand. "You're being selfish, Clara. You've had this property for years, while we were paying your car insurance, while we were providing you a roof. You sat on a piece of real estate worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and played the martyr." "I didn't play anything," I shouted, the fire finally breaking through the ice. "I survived. I took the only thing in this world that was truly mine, something you were too arrogant to even look at when Grandma died, and I turned it into a life. You didn't want a daughter. You wanted a success story you could take credit for at your dinner parties. You cast me out when I was broken, thinking I'd come crawling back on my knees. You didn't realize that by throwing me away, you gave me the only thing I ever needed: distance from you." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of things unsaid for 2 decades. My mother looked at the house, the slate blue paint, the sturdy porch, the vibrant garden of sea kale and lavender I'd planted, and I could see the gears turning. She wasn't seeing my hard work. She was seeing an asset. She was seeing a way to regain control. "We're your family," she said, her voice dropping to a manipulative, soft register. "We made a mistake, perhaps. We were stressed. But this house, it needs a family. It's too big for one person. We could help you manage it. We could list the guest rooms on those high-end rental sites. With your father's business mind and my eye for decor." "No," I cut her off. The word was a wall. "You will not manage this. You will not touch a single shingle of this house." "You wanted me to be independent? Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you asked for. I am so independent of you that you are now strangers on my property." "You can't be serious," Sarah hissed, her jealousy finally bubbling to the surface. "You're going to choose this lonely, salt-stained life over your own family? Look at you, Clara. You have paint in your hair. You smell like fish and turpentine. You're wasting your life." I smiled then, a genuine, terrifyingly calm smile. "I've never felt less wasted. For the first time, I'm not being used to fill a hole in your egos. I'm filling my own space." I stepped back and reached for the heavy oak door. "I'm going to go back to work now. I have a gallery opening to prepare for. I suggest you leave before the tide comes in and floods the low point of the driveway. It's a bit tricky for cars like yours." "Clara," my father called out, but I didn't turn back. I walked inside and locked the door. I stood in the entryway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I heard them outside, the muffled sounds of an argument, my mother's sharp tones, my father's placating murmurs. I heard the car doors slam, one by one. I heard the engine roar to life and the crunch of gravel as they retreated, defeated by a version of me they hadn't invited into existence. I walked to the window and watched the black SUV disappear behind the dunes. The house felt larger now, more vibrant, as if their departure had cleared out the last of the stagnant air. I looked at my hands, stained, calloused, and strong. They had tried to pack my bags to send me into the dark, but all they had done was send me toward the light. I picked up my brush, dipped it into a pool of deep, uncompromising blue, and began to paint the storm that had finally passed. The morning after they left, the world felt fundamentally different. The air was clearer, the light sharper, as if the departure of the black SUV had taken with it the last of the atmospheric pressure that had been weighing down on my chest for 24 years. I woke up not to the sound of scraping cardboard or the sharp cadence of a disappointment-filled lecture, but to the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the ocean. It was a sound that didn't demand anything from me. It simply existed, much like I was finally learning to do. I spent the early hours on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool sweater, watching the sun drag itself out of the Atlantic. The horizon was a jagged line of gold and mercury. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to reach for a phone to check for messages or scroll through the curated successes of people I barely knew. The silence wasn't a void anymore. It was a luxury. I realized then that my parents had spent my entire life trying to teach me how to be a diamond, hard, polished, and reflecting their light, but the sea had taught me how to be the water. Water is soft, but it is the most patient force on earth. It carves canyons, it swallows ships, it endures. By mid-morning, I was in my studio. The Clara's Coastal Designs sign was no longer just a piece of wood. It was a manifesto. I had 3 large canvases to finish for Elena's gallery opening, but my focus had shifted. I wasn't painting for the market anymore, or for the approval of a gallery owner. I was painting the truth of the last 6 months. I painted the bruises on my hands, the silver of the weathered shingles, and the way the light looked when it hit the heart pine floors. These weren't just landscapes. They were maps of a woman coming back to life. A week later, the gallery opening arrived. Grey Ledge was a quiet town, but when Elena put her mind to something, the whole county noticed. The gallery was a converted saltbox house near the docks, filled with the scent of lilies and expensive wine. I wore a simple black dress and kept my hair down, the salt air curls defying the straight-ironed perfection my mother had always insisted upon. As I stood in the corner of the room, watching people cluster around my work, I felt a strange sense of detachment. They were discussing the emotional depth and the raw, unforgiving textures of my paintings. They saw the art, but they didn't see the woman who had sanded her own floors until she couldn't feel her fingers. They didn't see the girl who had been cast out like trash. You did it, Selena said, sliding a glass of sparkling cider into my hand. She looked at me with a sharp, knowing smile. And you did it with a single favor from anyone who shares your last name. That's the kind of success that doesn't tarnish, Clara. In the middle of the evening, my phone vibrated in my clutch. I had turned it back on a few days prior, mostly for business calls, but the number on the screen was Sarah's. I stepped out onto the gallery's small back deck to answer. Clara, she said, her voice unusually quiet. She's not doing well. She's telling everyone you've joined a cult or that you're having a breakdown. Dad is just staying in the garage. They're talking about legal action, something about the deed, and Grandma's mental state when she wrote the will. I looked out at the dark water of the harbor. A few months ago, this would have sent me into a panic. I would have been drafting apologies and looking for lawyers, desperate to prove I wasn't the villain in their story. Now, I just felt a weary kind of pity. Let them try, Sarah, I said, and I meant it. The deed is ironclad, and Grandma was sharper than Mom will ever be. But tell them this, if they take one step toward a courtroom, I'll take every text, every email, and the recording of the security camera from the morning they kicked me out, and I'll give it to every one of their friends at the club. I'll make sure the world knows exactly how they subsidized my failure. They value their reputation more than they value me. Tell them not to gamble with the only thing they have left. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that the little sister she used to talk over was gone. You've changed, she whispered. No, I replied. I just stopped pretending to be small so you could feel big. Don't call me again. I hung up and walked back into the warmth of the gallery. I sold 4 paintings that night, enough to pay my taxes for the next 2 years and fix the plumbing in the guest bathroom. But the money was secondary to the feeling of standing on my own 2 feet. As the weeks turned into months, my life in Grey Ledge solidified. I became a fixture at the cafe, no longer the city girl, but just Clara, the woman who lived in the blue house on the dunes. I learned to love the winter when the tourists vanished and the ocean turned into a roiling, white-capped beast. I found a quiet strength in the solitude. I realized that being underestimated had been a gift. It had allowed me to build a fortress while they thought I was wandering in the woods. One evening, nearly a year after that first morning in the hallway, I walked down to the shoreline. The tide was out, leaving behind a wide, dark expanse of sand that mirrored the evening sky. I looked back at my house. The lights were on, casting a warm, amber glow through the windows I had cleaned myself. It looked like a beacon. I thought about the girl who had sat in that hallway, surrounded by boxes, feeling like her world had ended. I wished I could tell her that the end was actually the beginning. I wished I could tell her that the weight of those boxes was the only thing that would make her strong enough to carry her own future. The pain hadn't vanished. Betrayal like that leaves a scar that catches in the cold, but it no longer defined me. I wasn't the daughter who was kicked out. I was the woman who stayed. I wasn't the girl who lost her job. I was the artist who found her voice. I took a deep breath of the freezing salt-laden air and turned my back on the horizon. I walked up the dunes, my boots sinking into the sand, moving toward the light of my own home. I was unbound. I was whole, and as the door clicked shut behind me, I knew I was finally, irrevocably, home.